I said this was going to be the climate change election, but mostly the major parties have been pretty quiet on the issue. A couple of planetary alarm bells have rung during the campaign. A United Nations report recently warned 1 million species are at risk of extinction, and just today, somebody found an empty chip packet. Well, it was a plastic bag, actually, and lolly wrappers, I'm serious about those, at the deepest point on the Earth, the bottom of the Mariana Trench, which plunges 11 kilometres below sea level. Well, in Australia, it's still mostly about the politics, with Labor using the perceived difficulties within the coalition on climate policy to make this attack ad.
Climate change. He denies it. He got dumped over it. He ignores it. She misunderstands it. He bungled it. He helps create it.
Don't worry about anybody else. I couldn't give a stuff.
And they'll suffer from it. The chaos within the Liberal National Government is out of control, but it's nothing compared to the chaos of a Morrison-Palmer One Nation government.
The ABC's Vote Compass lists the environment as the most important issue for voters ahead of the economy. But while that anxiety is rising, so are Australia's carbon emissions. Here is a graph, have a look, of Australia's emissions compiled by the Department of Environment, Federal Department. In 2005, we hit that high point there in the middle of the graph. Now, the GFC hits, line goes down, the emissions start to fall. In 2011, the Gillard government introduces the carbon tax. Emissions continued to decline. There they go. That's until Tony Abbott is elected. He repeals the carbon tax, introducing his $2 billion direct action policy. Now, despite that policy, emissions start to rise. In 2015, Mr Abbott agrees to a Paris target of reducing emissions by at least 26% on 2005 levels. And from there, you'd hope that the emissions would go down. But they go off in the opposite direction, with the department projecting further increases into the future, leaving us with a 695 megatonne reduction task to meet the Paris target. That's the lower line. Now, that's roughly equivalent to Australia emitting nothing, if we wanted to get from one line to the other, for a whole year. No carbon emissions, no cow farts, no burps, no cars, no mining. You get the picture. Meanwhile, there's more detail today from the ABC's environment reporter on how the CSIRO was pushed to formally accept the federal government's approval of the proposed Adani mine water plans in a single afternoon. The approval was the final federally controlled hurdle in the way of the mine. State approvals are still pending.
We played no part in the approval process. That's a question that you'd have to put to the department and CSIRO and Geoscience Australia. We've never shirked the science, and we were very happy for CSIRO and Geoscience Australia to be involved, and our issue is not with their involvement or the Queensland government going to them, not only impacting our company, but importantly the thousands of people in regional Queensland that want jobs, and also Australia's reputation for investment.
Dee Madigan, the chip packet, as I'm calling it, I imagine it could be a chip packet at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. It does get your attention.
It does.
Doesn't it?
It does. And cause you know why? My kids talk about the Mariana Trench. It's this thing they all learn at school. So I know when they hear this on the news, they're going to be kind of shocked. As parents, it does make you feel just the extent of what's happening. Yeah,
and what does it do when you hear it? What do you think, Parnell? Do you think of the urgency of the situation or the hopelessness of it?
Absolutely, and the urgency of managing the situation, because we also know where a lot of the waste comes from that makes its way into the ocean, and that is 90% of that is coming from just 8 rivers, or 10 rivers globally, 8 of them in Asia. So there is actually something we could do really practically and quickly to start addressing this, and that would be to work with those countries to manage their waste better. You know, plastic is such an important material for our civilisation. We use it all the time. That doesn't mean that we can't be a little bit clever about when we use it and when we don't. But we really have to look immediately at what we can do to stop things like that getting into the ocean, holus bolus, and the best thing we can do is waste management. Okay.
Shane, when we then turn to talk about climate change, right, do you think people understand? We saw that graph and we saw where our emissions are headed, according to the Federal Environment Department, and where they need to be headed, right, according to what we've promised for the Paris Agreement. Do you think Australians understand how deep the cuts to our emissions need to be to make that target by 2030?
No. And I don't think, even on a panel of esteemed people like this, it's difficult to comprehend the amount of change that is required to get down to those levels. Some of these, and you saw with the carbon tax that there are once you introduce a price signal, I'm talking it from an economics perspective, you do get change and that comes through. But we abandoned that because we want to believe in something else. But the magnitude of the change that has to take place to get down to that level is beyond really easy comprehension. But then again, like I was on the Bill Shorten campaign bus early in the campaign, and the number of homes where people have put on, say, solar PV gives you an idea that people, when they see a price signal in terms of, say, higher electricity costs, they can make a change. That's the one advantage that's still out there, at least in my deep, dark economic heart. That's what I hope.
What's that? That individual people making a change in individual lives will make the difference?
That a price signal of some sort, right. or just saying that, look, we can talk about the Mariana Trench. I think a lot of people will be waiting for Aquaman to come out of there rather than a plastic bag. But people talking about that, say the report that we had a week ago from the UN about the number of the expected extinctions that we're going to see, the fact that early in this year the first mammal to be wiped out by climate change, the old Bramble Cay rat up there on the Torres Strait, we lost due to climate change. Those sorts of things you are hoping will bring people to focus the mind, and perhaps that will focus the mind of policymakers.
It's interesting, isn't it? Nicole, if we turn to some analysis that the ABC put out today, we saw that graph at the beginning of the program of what's happening under the Coalition's climate change policy. Yeah. There was analysis of what Labor is proposing, a 45% reduction by 2030, and the analysis of that is that just scrapes through the bottom end of what needs to be done. Do you detect a disconnect between the population and the political class?
I think there's definitely a disconnect between the population and the political class, and depending on who you're speaking to, but I don't think you need to be an expert to understand that there's an urgency going on at the moment, and there's definitely an urgency in the air and people are feeling it, and it's very disconcerting, and it's quite, I don't know not what the quite right word for it is, but it's very disempowering at the moment to be thinking that, well, how many years left have we got on this planet before it starts to become more extreme in our weather changes? And like I said, I don't think you need to be an expert to be worried right now, and that's the feeling that I get within my circle of friends and what I'm experiencing in my own home and the things that I'm seeing within the media as well.
Atta, can I turn to you? I mean, the Labor Party ad said, Malcolm Turnbull couldn't get action on climate change. Well, it is the great political killer, isn't it? I mean, you could add Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd to the list of people who have fallen on the issue of the greatest moral challenge of our time, which is what Kevin Rudd called climate change. What do you think it is about this country that we've had this consensus in the public and in the Parliament about the need to act, and yet the graph tracks ever upward?
Yes, I'll be representing as a common citizens of this country, not any particular political party, and what is my feelings about it. And I look at it from three perspectives. Number one, this climate change policy is not an isolated thing. It is related to our economic policy, our mineral resources policy and energy policy. We need to, basing on that, we will decide whether we would like to have mines in future in our country or not. And everything has a cost. Like if we want to do something good, it also has some cost attached to it. So we need to decide whether action against climate change would be more costly, or inaction against climate change would be much more costly in future.
And do you feel that we're having that debate in the course of this election campaign?
Yes, it is there, but we need to have a constructive sort of discussion about it and national consensus, bipartisan consensus on this issue, which is not only important from Australia, but important for the humanity itself. And we can always point finger towards other countries that this waste is going from the Asian countries or Asian rivers, but we need to look at what we are doing to fight the climate degradation in this world.
Consensus.
Yeah, well, I think though we are getting more consensus because for so many years it was such a toxic debate because the Conservative side or the vested interests had said that action on climate change is going to drive up your power prices. That was their thing. And I think Shane hit the nail on the head. So many Australians now with their solar panels on the roof are seeing the reality that's quite different, that when you put renewable sources on your roof, your power prices are actually starting to come down. They get the logic of that, and I think it's taken the heat out of the climate change.
That is on a tiny, tiny individual scale. I mean, the truth
No,
of the matter
there's millions
is,
of them though.
No. In Germany, they have been working for the last 30 years on getting renewables to replace major sources of energy, and they have made such slow progress. They, and we are looking at creating the same impact in Australia over the next 10 years. So a 35% reduction over the next 10 years. Now in Germany, it's taken 30 years. It hasn't worked.
But the technology was different then. The technology is completely different.
The technology has improved, but we're talking about Germany. We are talking, you know, if this technology were suddenly working perfectly, then they would have simply replaced the nuclear power plants they took offline with this new technology.
The other day, South Australia went 6 hours off the grid.
Instead, they're building nuclear power plants overseas so that they can import the power back into Germany so that they can stop burning so much brown coal.
I just wonder, at this point of time, we have an opportunity to compare the two policies, right? So let's just start with the coalition. Can I turn to you, Shane? Can the coalition claim to be delivering real action on climate change? I mean, they've got the money there, $2.55 billion in 2014 invested in real action, another $2 billion now over 15 years, and the graph keeps going up. Can they deliver real action on climate change with this policy?
Well, their argument is they're going to use international carryover credits to reduce the emissions out to 2030. That's how they get there. What happens beyond 2030 when those credits disappear and our line jumps back up to where it was? Like that, it's a policy that has a shelf life of 2030 and then it dies again. But I actually think the awareness and the electricity market is actually driving part of this, because you are going to see a diminution in the number of coal-fired power stations because the banking sector has worked out, no, we can't continue to finance these things because the cost of renewables are just falling through going through the floor. Going to Parnell's issue about, say, nuclear power, we saw last year how 2 nuclear plants that were approved by the Obama administration of the United States have gone bankrupt, unfinished, because the costs of nuclear are just so over the top
because the cost of investing into it. I mean,
because you're having to sink the money into it, and no one wants to do it.
Because renewables pay off in a very short time for investors, which a nuclear power plant does not. But in terms of actually saving emissions long term, investing in nuclear gets you there much, much faster.
I'd argue the point there, especially because you're not taking into account what happens with the yellow cake at the end of the process, what you do with it. That's one of the costs that are always pushed out, and that's one of the costs that always defeat them.
If the emissions are the urgency, and I think we've got to take that seriously, then we've also got to look at what the quickest way of getting those emissions right down is. And so then all power sources have to be on the table, and frankly renewables are just not delivering.
Bringing down emissions is to put stuff in the ground that's terrible for the environment. I'm not sure that's a great solution.
Well, let's just stick with what's on offer at this election campaign, at least from the major parties, and I don't think any minor parties are proposing nuclear power stations. Let's look at Labor's plan.
Clive Palmer, I think, did.
Is he?
Yeah, I think so.
Yes,
okay.
Clive Palmer is.
There you are. Love a fact check. Labor's proposing a 45% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050, right? Now, the experts say that scrapes through at the bottom end of what's required till 2030, but as long as you get to net zero by 2050. And I just wonder, what are the prospects genuinely, hand on heart, Dee, that they're going to be able to get that through the Senate? Let's say that Clive, who you've just informed me does support nuclear power plants. Let's take him at his word, shall we? Let's say he gets 3 Senate seats, Queensland, New South Wales and Western Australia. Let's say that the Greens, as they have before, won't vote for it. Poor Nicole sitting there going, oh God,
oh my God,
painting this horrible picture. What are the prospects of getting this action through the Senate? We've played this game before.
Yeah, and there is no answer to that. It'll depend what happens on Saturday. I'm not sure that Clive will get 3 sort of seats in the Senate. Queensland for sure, but
does it come down to that?
It does. It absolutely does. But then there's trade-offs you make for that. You would hope that if a couple of the independents come in on the floor, that will also help Labor get it across. We don't know what's going to happen on Saturday, so
Nicole, I mean, we're going to talk about it in a minute. You ran as an independent in the Victorian state election.
Yeah,
when
I
people
did.
vote for the Greens or for One Nation wants to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, or the
They couldn't
UAP,
find Paris.
right, or the UAP. Do you think people are making a conscious decision about climate, or are they making a protest vote?
I think from